Can you imagine a 7-year-old child stepping onto a bus before sunrise, leaving behind a dirt floor kitchen and endless sugarcane fields, carrying little more than courage and a simple song? And could you picture that same boy growing into one of the most enduring voices in reggae history? That is the extraordinary journey of Freddy McGregor, a career that has spanned more than 6 decades. Yet behind the smooth vocals and timeless hits lie 2 deeply personal chapters. One involving years of silence about industry betrayal, and another a life-threatening medical crisis in 2022 that nearly ended it all. How does a man survive both professional exploitation and physical collapse, and still return stronger? Let's begin at the beginning. Freddie McGregor was born on June 27, 1956, in Clarendon, Jamaica. His early world was defined by hardship and rhythm in equal measure. Mornings began before the sun had fully broken through the mist that hovered over the sugarcane fields. His stepfather labored in those fields, machete swinging in steady arcs, cutting cane beneath a heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. His mother, a kindergarten teacher, balanced tenderness with iron discipline as she raised 8 children in a home that had more determination than possessions. There was no electricity in the early years. No running water. The kitchen floor was dirt, packed firm by years of footsteps. Yet laughter lived there. Prayer lived there. Music lived there. On Sundays, hymns floated through the small wooden church in Clarendon. Young Freddie listened closely, not just to the melody, but to the emotion. Why did certain notes make people close their eyes? Why did a simple chorus cause grown men to weep? In Clarendon, something remarkable had already happened. 2 local youths, Ernest Wilson and Peter Austin, had traveled to Kingston and recorded hits at the legendary Studio One. They returned not just with stories, but with proof that possibility existed beyond the cane fields. For young Freddie, they represented more than success. They were evidence that geography did not define destiny. At Hayes Primary School, Freddie composed a playful tune called Roll Dumpling Roll. He sang it with theatrical flair, his small hands moving dramatically as if he were already commanding a stage. Villagers would gather, smiling as coins clinked into his palm. Was it just charming childhood talent, or something deeper stirring beneath the surface? In 1963, at just 7 years old, Freddie boarded the Clarendon bus to Kingston. His mother tucked newspapers inside his shirt to prevent motion sickness, a folk remedy passed through generations. That small gesture carried layers of meaning. It was protection. It was faith. It was a quiet acknowledgement that her son's life might unfold far from her daily reach. The bus ride felt endless. As fields gave way to crowded streets, young Freddie pressed his face to the window. Kingston was louder, faster, unpredictable. The air smelled of salt and fuel. Vendors shouted. Music spilled from radios in shopfronts. When Ernest and Peter introduced Little Freddie at Studio One, skepticism filled the room. Children did not belong in serious recording sessions. Yet when he began to sing, conversation ceased. Musicians froze mid-motion. Producer Coxsone Dodd leaned forward. The voice was startling, clear, emotionally textured, far older than his years. Studio One became Freddie's classroom. Under Dodd's supervision, he observed legends reshaping American soul into something distinctly Jamaican. Songs were recorded live to 2-track tape. If the drummer missed a beat, the entire band started over. There were no digital edits. No shortcuts. What does that kind of environment do to a child? It teaches precision. It demands humility. It instills resilience. Between errands and rehearsals, Freddie absorbed everything. The shift from ska to rocksteady to reggae, the discipline required to survive in a competitive studio, the unwritten rules of the music business. Eventually, Dodd brought him into his home. For a country boy accustomed to cooking over open flames, this new world introduced etiquette, structure, and expectation. But it also introduced complexity. Between 1963 and 1968, Freddie recorded numerous tracks, including After Laughter and Why Did You Do It? His voice matured, his confidence sharpened. Yet compensation was murky. Contracts were vague. Payments were irregular. As a child, how do you question adults who control your opportunity? He remained silent, not out of ignorance, but out of survival. The early 1970s brought new growth. Freddie joined the band Generation Gap, where he met guitarist Dalton Brown and drummer Leroy "Horsemouth" Wallace. They were young men hungry for identity and control. The chemistry was electric. When the band dissolved, Freddie promised Brown he would one day create something stable, something owned. Promises made in youth often fade. But not this one. In 1975, Freddie embraced Rastafari and joined the 12 tribes of Israel. The transformation was internal before it became external. He committed to reading one chapter of the Bible daily. He grew his locks. His worldview deepened. Backlash followed. Some promoters hesitated. Critics whispered that Rastafarians were unreliable. Yet alongside artists like Dennis Brown, Freddie helped dismantle stereotypes. They dressed sharply. They arrived on time. They conducted themselves with professionalism. Was this cultural reform as important as the music itself? The late 1970s delivered a breakthrough. Working with producer Winston "Nini" Holness, Freddie released Bobby Babylon. The metaphor of a powerful ship navigating turbulent waters resonated deeply. The big ship identity was born, not as arrogance, but as declaration. On a flight from Baltimore to Kingston, he scribbled lyrics for "I'm Longing to See You" on the back of a boarding pass. Inspiration does not schedule appointments. It arrives mid-air, mid-thought, mid-life. Another milestone emerged when producer Clive Hunt shared a rhythm track. Encouraged by Dennis Brown, Freddie wrote "So Many Ways." Collaboration strengthened not only his catalog, but his sense of belonging. Then came loss. When Dennis Brown passed away in 1999, Jamaica mourned collectively. Freddie was devastated. He believed Brown deserved the highest national recognition. He personally contacted then Prime Minister P.J. Patterson to advocate for a state funeral. Why fight so passionately? Because legacy matters. Because cultural architects shape national identity. Brown received national honors, a victory not just for a fallen star, but for the principle that art carries weight equal to politics. By 1983, Freddie fulfilled his promise. He established Big Ship Records and built his own studio. This was not vanity. It was protection. If exploitation once shadowed his youth, it would not define the next generation. And what followed was remarkable. His son Stephen D. "Genius" McGregor became a Grammy-winning producer, collaborating with global figures like Sean Paul and Shakira. His son Chino McGregor thrived as producer and performer. His daughter Yashima carved her own creative path. Big Ship Studio became known for its open-door policy. Artists arrived with dreams larger than their wallets. Freddie remembered what it felt like to stand outside opportunity. He refused to become the gatekeeper he once feared. International success expanded. Shake It Up Tonight and Seeking You'll Find climbed UK charts simultaneously. Albums like Signature and Anything for You earned Grammy recognition. Through shifting eras, vinyl to cassette to CD to streaming, his voice retained warmth. In 2011, he voiced frustration. Veteran artists struggled for radio play in Jamaica, while overseas audiences packed venues across Europe and Asia. How could the birthplace of reggae sideline its pioneers? Was the industry chasing novelty over heritage? Was profit outweighing principle? In 2016, Freddie responded through music. His album True to My Roots was unapologetically traditional. It traveled far beyond Jamaica, Japan, Germany, Kenya, Brazil. Fans believed it merited Grammy recognition. When the award went to Ziggy Marley instead, debate ignited. Was it disappointment? Certainly. But it was also clarity. Validation does not define authenticity. Then came 2022. A sudden medical emergency placed Freddie in intensive care. Machines monitored breath and heartbeat, the very instruments that had carried his career. Doctors reportedly warned his singing voice might not recover. For a man whose identity was woven into melody, what could be more frightening? Fans feared the worst. Had the big ship reached its final harbor? Recovery was slow, painful, humbling. There were days when lifting his head felt monumental. Days when doubt whispered louder than faith. Yet discipline, honed since childhood, returned. So did prayer. So did family. Gradually, strength returned. The first rehearsal was cautious. The first sustained note fragile but present. When he stepped back onto stage, applause felt different, not triumphant, but grateful. Two revelations stand tall in his later years. First, the acknowledgement of early industry exploitation. After decades of silence, he chose to speak, not for revenge, but for education. Younger artists deserved transparency. Second, the medical crisis that forced reflection. When applause fades and hospital lights replace stage lights, what remains? For Freddy McGregor, the answer has always been faith, family, and purpose. His story invites deeper questions for those who have crossed into reflective decades of life. Have we honored our childhood promises? Have we forgiven past betrayals? Have we built structures that protect those who follow? From a dirt floor kitchen in Clarendon to international acclaim. From silent endurance to public advocacy. From hospital bed to stage lights. His life illustrates a truth often overlooked. Longevity is intentional. So what is your big ship? What dream are you steering through calm seas and sudden storms? Freddy McGregor's voyage continues, not merely as entertainment, but as testimony. For a generation that understands both struggle and triumph, his melody remains a reminder that resilience is not accidental. It is practiced daily, quietly, faithfully. And perhaps the most powerful question of all is this. When your storm arrives, will your ship be ready? Freddy McGregor has always been more than a voice on a record. He's a living archive of a music and a people. His story is about rhythm and resistance, about laughter backstage and the small, stubborn acts of integrity that add up over a lifetime. It's about the way one man can refuse to be polished into acceptability, and in doing so remind the world what authenticity sounds like. But to understand the turn his life took in recent years, the public rose, the private losses, the medical scare, and the improbable return, we have to slow down and look closely. How do you measure the cost of speaking up in an industry that rewards silence? How do you keep performing after the person who read your cues for half a century is gone? And what does it mean to rebuild a life and a voice after a stroke takes both as collateral? A conversation that became a controversy. It began, as so many controversies do, with a question asked out loud. McGregor had watched the awards season for decades. He had seen triumph and oversight, recognition and neglect. When he addressed the Grammy Awards publicly, calling them an embarrassment to reggae music, it was not a personal swipe so much as a spotlight on a long-standing imbalance. He pointed to numbers, not as a math test but as symptoms. The Marley family by then had collected an astonishing number of Grammys. Their contributions were massive and undeniable, but McGregor wanted the record to reflect a broader history. What about Dennis Brown? What about Beres Hammond? What about Burning Spear? What about Marcia Griffiths? Were their songs any less central to the soundtrack of struggle and love? Those names, Ziggy Marley, Dennis Brown, Beres Hammond, Burning Spear, and Marcia Griffiths, are shorthand for entire eras, communities of listeners and performers whose work shaped the language of reggae. To omit them from the conversation was, McGregor argued, to distort history. Then came the detail that made headlines, a close family connection to the awards process in California. Reporters mentioned that Ziggy Marley's wife had a governance role in a California chapter of the Grammy process. To an outsider that might read like inside baseball. To McGregor, it looked like a conflict of interest, the kind that corrodes trust more than it helps anyone's career. Was he brave for saying it? Or reckless? That is more than a theoretical question. For an artist who has existed in the same community as promoters, labels, and festival bookers for decades, public criticism can cost you appointments and friendly inboxes. Some called him bitter. Others feared he'd burned bridges. But there is another kind of cost. What's the price of staying quiet when you see a system that privileges a few while erasing many? A ripple began to move. The industry didn't erupt in a single, cinematic confrontation. There were no dramatic resignations or televised apologies. Instead there were meetings, slightly altered ballots, a few new seats on panels populated by people with deep roots in reggae. Over time, quietly, almost invisibly, The selection process began to incorporate more voices from within the community. Coincidence? Institutional evolution? Or the consequence of someone willing to name an uncomfortable truth? That question hung over the scene the way a chord holds a note, long enough to let you measure the interval between what was and what might be. For younger fans, the whole thing might have seemed like gossip. For those who had been following the genre since their 20s, it felt like the repair of a small injustice. The Silent Center. Dalton Brown. If the Grammy controversy was stormy weather, the next phase of McGregor's life brought a hurricane of a different kind. Grief. Dalton Brown, musical director, stage confidant, friend, had been with McGregor since 1975. Imagine playing decades of notes with someone until the pauses between phrases take on a language of their own. That was the relationship. Dalton was both architect and anchor, arranging songs so they flowed like a river, knowing when to let a solo breathe, when to tighten the rhythm section so a lyric could land. He read McGregor's face the way sailors read the sky. Their rehearsals were shorthand, a lift of the eyebrow, a cut of the eye. In a way, Dalton was the invisible half of the performance. When Dalton died in the early 2020s, the loss was not just personal. It was procedural. The band had rehearsed for decades with the expectation of his steady presence. They knew where he would stand. They knew the safety of his count-ins. Standing on stage without him became a different craft. McGregor described the sensation as a wound deeper than any professional slight. Awards can be disputed, contracts renegotiated, reputations patched. The human rituals of late-night jokes, the shared cigarettes before a long drive, the knowing silence after a song reached its end, those are irreplaceable. For many people in midlife, such a loss lands differently than it does in youth. The people you lose in your 50s or 60s are not replaceable friends but chapters closing. A funeral scene can be a small play, a pastor, a few songs, stories recounted with laughter that feels like medicine. Dalton's funeral felt that way, and then some. Stories of scrappy road gigs, of missing flights that turned into impromptu sessions, of the time they played for a small crowd in a hall that smelled like fried food and still felt like a cathedral. McGregor spoke then, not with dramatic flourish but with the economy of someone naming truth. He made the music safe for my voice. And after the funeral, the band had to go on. Grief changes the muscle memory of performance. A guitar player will watch the space where a second voice used to cue a chorus. A percussionist will count one thought ahead, anticipating the absence. Audiences can feel it, too. You don't need to be told someone is gone to notice that a groove is missing. The stroke. When the body betrays a life. If loss of a colleague was a private wound, the stroke McGregor suffered in November 2022 was a rupture that made the private public. He was in South Florida when the event happened. For a performer whose identity was built on bodily presence, voice, posture, timing, small improvisations that only a lifetime of practice can produce, the diagnosis felt like exile. At 66, the charts all suggested a long, uncertain path. Doctors were cautious. The language in the hospital was clinical and conservative, long recovery, likely impairment, uncertain prognosis. We often think of a singer as an instrument you can set aside and tune again. The reality is messier. A stroke does not just silence a voice. It disorganizes the map of habit that lives in muscles, lungs, and nerve pathways. For someone whose livelihood and meaning are the same thing, that was terrifying. What happened next is a sequence of small miracles, stubbornness, support, and a lot of hard work. McGregor leaned on his faith. He read the Bible many times over in those months, returning to texts that had undergirded him for decades. That faith was not showy. It was the quiet accordion of practice that rhythmically pulled him forward. Friends and family formed a net, visiting hospital corridors, sitting through therapy sessions, playing old tracks on loop so the brain could hear what it once knew. What does rehabilitation even mean for a performer? Physical therapists turned speech exercises into music, asking him to hum scales and then to hold phrases the way a carpenter holds a wooden beam while measuring. Occupational therapists taught him to feed himself, to button a shirt. But music therapists, those practitioners who speak through melody rather than through clinical instruction, helped him map memory to sound. This is not to romanticize rehabilitation into a plot device. Recovery is slow. It includes regressions, bad days, and moments of brutal clarity where fear is the prevailing soundtrack. And yet, by early 2025, the reports were different. He was walking. His speech had recovered to surprising clarity. Muscles that had been limp responded. The question became less about whether he could live and more about whether he could return to doing what defined him. Would the music still be there, or had illness changed its grammar? So many of us have watched a parent or an older friend come back from illness. We know the math of it. Sometimes bodies reassemble themselves, sometimes they do not. When a public figure recovers, the moment is both personal and communal, like a city noticing a lighthouse that had dimmed suddenly but then glowed again. A return, first in a faraway place. What followed was a carefully planned return. Japan, a country at once geographically distant and emotionally receptive to reggae, was chosen as the site for his first major concert back. There is a certain logic to choosing a far-flung place for a return. Distance bends the expectations of home audiences, gives the artist a kind of protective glow, and lets the first performance be about music rather than the phone calls and obligations that would cascade if the reunion were staged in the artist's own backyard. When he walked onto that stage, thousands rose as one. For many in the crowd, he wasn't just a name. He was a weathered myth they had argued about in late-night bars and university dorm rooms. Fans who had once collected vinyl now had children who collected t-shirts. The reunion was cathartic. People cried, some openly, others with the stiff composure of people who had memorized a life's improvisations and now witnessed their return. The setlist was a careful mix of familiar songs and new pieces that acknowledged change without trying to pretend nothing had happened. But the miracle was not merely technical. Was it the brain's plasticity? The quality of post-stroke therapy? The sheer quantity of love thrown at the situation from every corner of the world? Or was it, as one family member suggested, some combination of science, faith, and the thing that lives in the middle of both? Purpose. What pulls someone back from the edge, if not a reason to come back to? For McGregor, music was not only profession, it was the scaffolding of meaning. The songs were a map of his life and the life of his people. Returning to sing them was less about proving anything, and more about returning to a language that had always made him whole. Homecoming. The moment that felt like a mirror. If Japan had been a testing ground, the real reckoning came at home. Jamaica is not just a territory on a map for him. It is the soil from which his music sprouted. Returning there to perform was to enter a conversation that had never really paused. The island's audiences had been with him through vinyl crackles, through radio interviews, through the personal landmarks of marriage, loss, and now recovery. On the Kingston stage, he shared space with younger artists like Chino and Sheena, names that signified not only talent but the next generation's take on the tradition he embodied. Watching them sing his songs, sometimes in new arrangements, was like watching your child read the book you once wrote. It feels dangerous until you realize the book is still the same, only its sentences are now held by new hands. When Chino and Sheena came on stage, the crowd's energy shifted. There is a kind of collective release in seeing continuity. The older audience members smiled in a way that spoke of relief and gratitude. The younger ones danced as if every beat were discovery. What is legacy, if not the handing over of a torch that continues to burn with authentic flame? The economics of artistry hardly capture this. The net worth figures tossed around in tabloids, estimates of around $1 million for instance, are a distraction. You can't shop for intangible things like cultural trust or the way a line from a song slides into a community's speech. McGregor's wealth, by that greater accounting, is a catalog of songs, a family that breathes music, and a global audience that keeps singing back. A wider lesson about courage and compromise. There's a moral thread here that's not sermonizing but observational. Speak up when institutions feel unjust, and you risk isolation. Hold tightly to the practices that ground you, and you may be labeled stubborn. Face grief like a private war and then show up in public, and people will ask whether you are brave or simply stubborn. What would you do if you were him? When the industry whispers that keeping quiet will get you further than calling out malpractice, how do you weigh conscience against career? Many of us have been tested in smaller ways. A boss asking you to bend a truth, a family member requesting silence about a hurtful pattern, a community asking you to forget a slur to keep the peace. McGregor's life is an extended version of that smaller moral algebra. For people in midlife, the stakes feel different. You have less runway to rebuild. You have a reputation people already ascribe to you. Yet sometimes the refusal to compromise becomes the only thing that ensures the work you do is recognizable as yours. Does that narrow options? Yes. Does it keep the music honest? Often, yes. And so the lesson is paradoxical but simple. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do in a long career is to refuse short-term gains that erode long-term integrity. Community, ritual, and the ordinary acts that hold a life together. One of the quieter through lines of this story are the small rituals. The way the band gathers to tune their instruments before a show, the way he reads a verse before bed, the phone calls with siblings, the writing in notebooks. These are the scaffolding of normal life. They are also what makes a return from illness possible. Fans sent letters and video messages. Friends organized prayer circles. Venues that had booked him when he was at his peak offered empty dates so that when he could return the logistics were clear. In other words, the infrastructure of affection built up over decades does not evaporate with a hospital stay. It often shows up when you need it most.